TFA Fam, how do you do? Welcome back to another edition of the Fantasy Authority podcast. Today, we're going to be hitting you with the wide receiver rankings for Week 15, heading into the semifinals of the Fantasy Championships. Trying to help you guys get to the ship next week and get that dub. Before we jump into everything, we're going to be talking about these wide receivers. I'm sure this guy's going to be a wide receiver one on everyone's rankings. If you're interested, could I interest you in an Allen Robinson, one like this perhaps, that may or may not be autographed? I don't know. If that's something that interests you, hit that subscribe button. We are going to be giving this away December 27th during the live stream of Championship Week. So please be sure to hit that subscribe button and tune in for your shot to win that super sick, super authentic, super sweet Allen Robinson jersey. We're going to jump right into things. Wide receiver is always one of my favorite positions to talk about, and it's also one of the most maddening to try and rank and figure out for people with start sits. But if you're unfamiliar with how this is going to go, Kev has his rankings loaded up onto the screen that you can see on the YouTube show. I'm going to talk about the Fantasy Pros consensus rankings to give this a little bit of a balance. Kev has his wide receiver one rankings as such. Devontae Adams at 1, Tyreek Hill, DeAndre Hopkins, DK Metcalf at 4, Keenan Allen, A.J. Brown, Michael Thomas, Allen Robinson, at 8, Stephon Diggs at 9, Calvin Ridley, Terry McLaurin, and Bobby Trees, a.k.a. Bobby Forrest, a.k.a. Robert Woods, rounding out the wide receiver one rankings. Kev, a.k.a. Fantasy Rat 13. Talk to the folks about some of these wide receiver ones that you were excited about this week.
Yeah, first off, I want to talk about Terry McLaurin, who I know for some people are really going to be really strongly consider sitting him this week because of what he's done the last 2 weeks. He's really struggled, like I said, with 4 and 3 fantasy points over that span. However, those were some pretty tough matchups against the Steelers and 49ers. This week, they'll be taking on a much, much easier opponent in the Seattle Seahawks in terms of their defense. They allow the most fantasy points to the position at wide receiver, and they've also allowed they've allowed so much. They've actually allowed 200 more receiving yards to the next closest, which is the Falcons, in terms of how bad they've been against wide receivers this year. So I think this is a really good get-right spot for Terry McLaurin. That's why I have him back at wide receiver 11. I think Fantasy Pros has him at like wide receiver 14, 15, 16, somewhere in that range. I'm obviously much higher on him than they are. But despite the drop-off in production, it really isn't a volume issue. He's still seeing 26% of the targets, which is 9th most among all wide receivers, and accounts for 41% of the area or the market share of the air yards in this offense. So I do like Terry McLaurin quite a bit. And it really doesn't bother me if it's Dwayne Haskins or it's Alex Smith. I think this is a really good matchup for Terry McLaurin. They're likely going to be trailing. Are going to have to throw the ball. And, this is a defense you certainly can do that against. So I do like Terry McLaurin to kind of bounce back this week. So people that, maybe a little hesitant starting him. The other one is Robert Woods. Like we already mentioned against the Jets. The Jets are fucking awful against the pass. And where a lot of teams have chosen to kind of abandon the run to just simply throw all over this defense because they are terrible. Over the last 4 weeks, he leads the team in targets. He has 23% target share. The Jets allow the 4th most fantasy points to position, double-digit targets in the previous 3 weeks prior to last week for Robert Woods. So there's a lot of fantasy goodness here coming Bobby Tree's direction. So I do like him quite a bit. And I like Cooper Kupp as well. I think both of them are very viable assets, or very viable options this week in a matchup against the New York Jets.
Yeah, you were correct. Terry McLaurin sitting at wide receiver 16 in the Fantasy Pros consensus rankings. Somebody that I just want to touch on real quick before we move on to the wide receiver 2s, and that is Keenan Allen. I talked about him on the quarterback show. You talked about Austin Eckler on the running back show. I just think that the Chargers are kind of in a bounce back performance and a bounce back spot for their offense on Thursday going up against the Raiders. Keenan Allen should face off mostly against LaMarcus Joyner, who's giving up the 4th most yards in slot coverage, and he's tied for the 7th most receptions allowed out of the slot per PFF. Keenan hasn't had one of his, massive outing games, one of those, 162, I think was the last game he put up against the Jets, 10 catches and at least one score. but he's still seeing double-digit targets over the last 3 weeks. And, like I said from the quarterback show, I do think this entire offense is in a bounce-back spot. So I love Keenan going up against the Raiders this week. Move things on to the wide receiver twos. You have Adam Thielen sitting here at wide receiver 13, followed by Deontay Johnson. You were talking about Ben Roethlisberger as one of your favorite plays this week at quarterback on the quarterback show. Brandon Ayuk, Justin Jefferson, T.Y. Hilton, Cooper Kupp, Chris Godwin, Tyler Lockett, Corey Davis, Robbie Anderson, Juju Smith-Schuster, and then Mike Evans sitting down here at wide receiver 24. Who are some of these plays that are jumping out to you, and some of the guys that you're excited about week 15 amongst these wide receiver twos?
I could go in a couple different directions here. There's a lot of wide receivers on this list that I really do like. Not just the guys I'm going to talk about, but Brandon Ayuk, especially with Deebo Samuel out. This dude has just smashed. I think he has 4 straight games of at least 20 fantasy points after last week's performance that he had. So Brandon Ayuk, T.Y. Hilton is a guy that I know people love. And if you play DFS on DraftKings, he is still only 5,500, which makes fucking no sense. Again, in this matchup against Houston, Chris Godwin, I like him. There's just a lot of really good matchups here this week for a lot of these wide receivers. But I'm going to talk about 2 main guys, and one is Deontay Johnson, aka Butterfingers. He was benched basically in the first half of last week and part of the second half as well last week against the Bills. I don't know, man. What's really going on with him? I think maybe some of it could just be in his head, because the dude's an electric wide receiver. In my opinion, he's the best wide receiver that they have. And I know some people may make a case for Juju or whatever, but in terms of just overall, everything he brings to the table, he really, really does remind me of Stephon Diggs. I think he has that kind of ceiling of Stephon Diggs. And I think this is just a short-term issue. I know he leads the league in drops, but I would be willing to bet that most of those have come over the last 2 or 3 weeks, because the last couple of weeks, I know he's had at least 5 or 6 of them. But regardless of that, he's still 9th in targets among all wide receivers. He's 23% target share, 11th in yards after the catch. So he's a super electric guy. They get the Bengals this week. Like I said, there's not a corner on that defense that I'm even worried about remotely with Deontay Johnson. So I like Deontay Johnson to bounce back. I know he has his weeks where he's been really boom, but he hasn't had too many weeks where he's ever really killed you. Even last week, considering the fact that he was benched for almost half of the game, or over half the game. He only played 48% of the snaps, which is much lower than what he normally does. He still ended up, I think, close to 10 fantasy points, which isn't obviously great by any means. I think he could have had a much better game had he been able to play. But regardless of that, I think this is a good bounce back spot for Deontay. The other one was Corey Davis. I know people are going to be down on him because he did not meet expectations last week, but the guy is still, if you look at his numbers, he's 23% of the targets, 56 receptions, 835 yards. Listen, the funny thing with him, to me also is that if you look at him and AJ Brown's numbers, they're almost identical. They're about the same player, and everybody's perception of AJ Brown is much higher than what Corey Davis's is. People aren't talking about sending AJ Brown. AJ Brown had a good game, but at the same time, Corey Davis gets a great matchup this week against the Lions. They're likely going to be without their top 3 corners. There is some trepidation with him because of the fact that the Titans could just run all over them with Derrick Henry. But, we'll see. Like I said, a lot of it's going to depend on if Matt Stafford's out. But even still, they're still going to throw the ball. It's not like Derrick Henry's going to rush the ball 50 times in this game. Sure, Derrick Henry has the ability to break off long runs, but I do think Corey Davis, at worst, to me, I think he's a mid-level wide receiver 2, but I think at worst, he's a wide receiver 3. I'm definitely playing him unless you just are loaded at wide receiver.
The guy that I want to touch on real quick, kind of touched on in passing, that is Brandon Ayuk. You were mentioning, the 20-point fantasy games over the last several weeks. He has at least 17 in each of his last 5 games, and he has at least 20 points in 3 of his last 4. And the game that he did not hit 20, he hit 19.7. It looks like Deebo is potentially out for the year with that hamstring injury. They're really not playing for anything. It doesn't make sense to try and rush him back into action, when he was questionable going into that game anyway. But over the last 3 weeks, Ayuk is seeing 13 targets, 7 catches, and 96 yards, and he has 2 scores he has 2 touchdowns in 2 of the last 3 weeks. They're getting the Cowboys. We don't have to go into detail about how bad they are. They're giving up the fourth most fantasy points per game to wide receivers. You touched on Bobby Woods already. Cooper Kupp, obviously, that extends to him as well, and I think he's obviously in a great matchup going up against the Jets in a spot where the book has been out on Jared Goff for a while, but the Jets, even though that they are, I think they're blitzing at like the third highest rate in the league. I want to say like top 5 at least, but they're sitting all the way down at I think like the 7th lowest pressure rate in the entire NFL amongst all the defenses. So even though they're blitzing at a super high rate, they're just not getting home. The Rams offensive line has obviously looked really good the past couple of weeks. So Cooper Kupp, I think, is in a really nice spot as well. And we'll just move things on over to the wide receiver 3s. At wide receiver 25, you have Brandon Cooks, followed by Amari Cooper, Marvin Jones, Curtis Samuel, Jarvis Landry, Chase Claypool. The Beasles, Cole Beasley, Kiki Cootie, Michael Pittman, Marquise Brown, Sterling Shepard, and Rashard Higgins finishing things out at wide receiver 36. Who on this list do you want to wax on?
Yeah, I'm going to start with Curtis Samuel, who, again, another guy that's kind of flown under the radar a little bit this year, but has put together a pretty solid season. We'll also have to monitor DJ Moore, who missed last week due to not just injury, but also due to being put on the COVID list. So even if he makes it back, he also had that injury that looked like it was going to be really severe, and he got lucky. To be honest with you, if I'm the Panthers, I sit DJ Moore the rest of the year. There is absolutely no reason to run him out there. They're playing for nothing. And, let the guy heal up and, don't come back too soon and re-injure something and cause a major injury whenever that's just not needed. But regardless of that, Curtis Samuel, he has double-digit fantasy points the last 3 weeks. He's 24 targets over the last 3 weeks. He has 30 20-point fantasy performances in 3 of the last 6 weeks. And like I said, could be without DJ Moore. And they're playing the Packers this week on Saturday Night Football. We get 2 Saturday night games this week, so that should be a lot of fun. But that's going to be a game that they're definitely going to be trailing. They're going to have to throw the ball. They're not going to have Christian McCaffrey. They like to get Curtis Samuel involved in a number of different ways, whether it be out of the backfield or, through the air. So I like Curtis Samuel a lot. I think he's a solid wide receiver 3. This week. And the other guy is Rashard Higgins. He's not a guy I love, but I think he's something that you can definitely play in a pinch, because if you have to respect the last 2 weeks of what he's been able to do. He put up week 13, 21.5, which was wide receiver 11. Week 14 against Baltimore, which was last week, he put up 18.8, which is wide receiver 16. He has 19 targets over the last 2 weeks. He's playing, right around 75, averaging right around 75% of the snaps playing 75% of the snaps. Like I said, 19 targets, 12 receptions over the last 2 weeks. He has been kind of, the standout guy here on this offense, not named Jarvis Landry. So I think if they're going to have to throw the ball, they are playing the Giants this week on Sunday Night Football, which the Giants defense has been, I think better than what a lot of people expected. But I think it's still a defense you can throw the ball on. And I think that Rashard Higgins does make some sense in 12-team leagues and higher, teams that are looking for, solid depth. And I think he's somebody that can provide 15 to 20 fantasy points, which is what he's been able to do. So I do like Rashard Higgins, if you are in a pinch.
I just want to touch on someone real quick before we wrap things up. And this might be low-hanging fruit, because hopefully this changes. I'm expecting it to change. I'm hoping it changes. If it doesn't, Fantasy Pros, I don't know what you're doing. You had this guy as a wide receiver 2. When I looked this up this morning, he was sitting at wide receiver as a wide receiver 3, rather, in the Fantasy Pros consensus rankings, and that was T.Y. Hilton. And I think we just really quickly need to touch on putting some respect on this guy already. If you do not watch Nate's trends and reactions video, he kind of touched on this a little bit, where this definitely happens in the fantasy community and with analysts as a whole, where it's the kind of the first impression bias, if you will, where it's like, the first 2-3 weeks that we see from someone is, well, that's what they are. They're not going to change. There's no way they could be any better or any worse. This is what it is. It's written in stone. With T.Y. Hilton, through his first 9 games, had 1 double-digit fantasy week. And through those first 9 games, he was at wide receiver 85. Over the last 3 weeks, Hilton is sitting at wide receiver 3. I mean, we touched on Hilton being a waiver pickup just a couple of weeks ago. And over the last 3 weeks, he's gone 4 for 81 in the score, 8 for 110 in the score, and then last week was 5 for 86 and 2. And now he gets the awful, the dreadful, the woeful Houston defense, who he hit up for 8 for 110 in the score that I just touched on just 2 weeks ago. So he's someone who you can fire up and not think twice about. Like I said, maybe low hanging fruit. I'm expecting that ranking to change, but if it doesn't, it absolutely does. And I think depending on your wide receiver situation, he's someone who you can just plug in and not think twice about. So again, we appreciate you guys joining us. If you're not yet subscribed, hit that subscribe button. If you're listening on a podcast platform, leave us a rate and review and subscribe over there as well. We really do appreciate it. Again, the giveaway for the A-Rob jersey and the TFA t-shirts will be Sunday, December 27th during the live stream, which starts at 11 a.m. Eastern. We will be going live this Wednesday night to answer your questions, and obviously this Sunday as well at the same time. So I hope to see you guys soon. Drop any questions you have in the comments section, or just join us live Wednesday night and Sunday night. Talk to you soon.